was a few hours before Liverpool played Tottenham at the end of October, I think it was. It was on a Sunday, on a very quiet Sunday. I went in, it was a very sort of dark room initially. It was a bit like a nightclub sort of feel. The pastor appeared on the stage and obviously started speaking.
And God, we look to you tonight. Above the singing, God, above the music, above the songs, let your name be lifted high, Jesus. Let your name be honored, God. And we commit all that we are to you, God, everything that we do. And we reach towards you, Jesus. Amen.
It was a very, very unusual experience for me.
Earlier in the month, Liverpool goalkeeper Alisson posted a video of himself and teammate Roberto Firmino on Instagram. Nothing surprising there, you might think, but in the video, Alisson was seen baptising Firmino. Having seen the clip, The Athletic's Simon Hughes wanted to dig a little deeper into the topic of religion and football, asking the question, how did religion come to play such an important role at Liverpool Football Club? In this episode, Simon joins us to tell us what he learned. A couple of weeks ago, you wrote an article for The Athletic titled Alisson, Roberto Firmino and Religion's Role at Liverpool and in the Premier League. What prompted you to write this piece?
I've been following Alisson Becker's Instagram account mainly because he leaves messages there about his religious faith, and it sort of pricked my consciousness, I guess, towards the end of last season when Liverpool won the Champions League. And obviously the first thing that he did was rip off his shirt, and he had a t-shirt on underneath thanking Jesus. This came obviously a few weeks after Tottenham knocked out Ajax in the semi-final, and Lucas Moura went to great lengths to thank Jesus for his contribution towards Tottenham's rise to the Champions League final. And it just got me thinking, that there's got to be something written about this sort of phenomenon. It did seem that Brazilian players were particularly receptive to Pentecostalism. So, as it seems to be with The Athletic, we sort of throw about ideas about what we could write about. And we had an idea about religion generally in sport, and originally it was going to be a bigger piece on the presence of religion involving other clubs, but the way it sort of mapped out, I ended up going to the church just off Jamaica Street, and it leads up towards Toxteth in Liverpool Southend. And I did that in October time, and then sort of parked a lot of the information that I found until it became relevant, I guess, because I often find that some of these features that people tend to react to them and want to read about them more when it is actually in the news. And clearly Alisson Becker was videoed baptising Roberto Firmino, and I just thought it'd be a good time to sort of develop on the idea and write a bit more about my experience at Hillsong. It's right next to an area where there was a lot of immigration, an area which has big West African community, big Caribbean community. So there's a lot of people in those areas who are attracted to evangelicalism. As I write in the piece, it's a faith that Alisson Becker's been involved in since he was living in Brazil, where evangelicalism is sort of explaining a lot of the country's modern identity. It's sort of been on the rise for the last 30 years, really. I came away from that day just sort of keen to learn more, really, about why footballers, particularly obviously Alisson, have turned towards it. And over the coming weeks and months, obviously did a lot of research and spoke to a few people who I know who've got experience of dealing with Brazilian footballers and people who've got a better knowledge of religion than I have, to try and piece together why footballers particularly are finding it quite a defining part of their lives. So that's really how I guess it all came together.
There's obviously a few protagonists in the story that you wrote. The majority of those obviously at Liverpool. So you've got Alisson Becker is the main player really, but there's Roberto Firmino, Divock Origi's mentioned. We also know that Mohamed Salah and Sadio Mane are very religious as well. There's another two players that you mentioned as well, Aurelio Gomez and Lucas Moura, who aren't at Liverpool. But would you say that Liverpool is different to other Premier League clubs in its attitude to religion?
Well, I think it stems from Jurgen Klopp, really. I mean, when we talk about religion, we tend to deal in extremes. It is quite possible that somebody has a religious faith, which, okay, on a day-to-day basis, plays a role in their life and it helps them through life. It's not necessarily quite as dramatic as it might seem. So, for example, seeing video footage of Alisson Becker baptising Roberto Firmino might seem unusual, or it certainly gets people talking, doesn't it, when you see that? The reality is, at Liverpool, I think Jurgen Klopp, he's a Protestant who was brought up as a Catholic. He turned to Protestantism after his dad died, mainly, I think, because he saw how hard his dad had worked. And, he died quite suddenly, and it changed the way he felt about mere existence, I think. And I think if you look at Jurgen Klopp, he's always said about how he wants people who are smart and perceptive, but not necessarily the cleverest people in the room all the time. He wants people with opinions, but you don't have to be particularly dogmatic with it. And I think a lot of the footballers at Liverpool are quite along those lines. They have a faith, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily dogmatic with it. And although evangelicalism sort of conjures up images of extreme religion, the reality is, on a day-to-day basis, although we might mention it, it's not always, as dramatic as it might seem, even though there is the footage of what we saw a couple of weeks ago. So it does play a role in people's lives. I think Jurgen Klopp likes players to have some sort of faith because he sees it as it helps players with their balance and the way they can get through their lives. So I know he has conversations, speaking to people at Liverpool, he does have conversations with players when they sign about their faith and what they think about, their existence in the world. But it doesn't mean that, he's signing people who necessarily want to spread the word of God. It's quite clear that Mohamed Salah has a faith, but he's not absolutely led by that faith. It's just a part of his life which helps him from time to time. Same with Sadio Mane. I know Sadio Mane, although, he's a Muslim and a practicing Muslim and he goes to church every week, he has, in my research, found that, his best friend in Senegal was actually a Christian. So it shows you, that there's open-mindedness and the players live amongst each other, despite having faiths that in the outside world, in the extreme outside world, might clash sometimes. It's quite clear that all these players tend to get on, really. So, yeah, I'd say that's sort of the balance of it. Maybe other managers in the Premier League don't have as strong a faith as Jurgen Klopp does, and maybe that's a reflection in their teams, I guess. Every team is a reflection of the manager in many ways, and I think Jurgen Klopp tends to surround him with people who think roughly along the same lines, and I guess that applies to religion.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Klopp's influence. In the article itself, you wrote, a decade ago the club discouraged players from talking about religion openly, but since Klopp's arrival this has changed. Why do you think the club was so careful to avoid the religious issue previous to Klopp's arrival?
I remember doing an interview a long time ago now. I was with Momo Sissoko, who is a Muslim, and I remember being quite pleased with the interview. He was quite open about his faith, and I remember the club at the time, so this is 2007-8, weren't particularly happy with the content of that interview. And in terms of brand management, Liverpool, were quite behind the times really when it came to exercising the brand of Liverpool Football Club, and I think they wanted the club to appeal to everybody and nobody in particular. So religion was a bit of a taboo subject in that sense. I also think they were very cautious around players speaking openly about such a divisive subject which could draw undue attention to them. I think the club just basically wanted, players to stick to football, and that was it really. That's changed since Jurgen Klopp has come along, because he obviously references religion openly in open press conferences. Sometimes he says, thank God.
You'll be judged on something, won't you? You'll be judged.
I'm not interested who judge me. God judged me one day. And that's the only thing I'm interested in. What other people say about me, I couldn't be less interested.
It's quite clear that he has that conscience, and when the manager has that conscience, it means that it's a lot easier for other players to sort of operate underneath that and act true to their beliefs. Now, I don't think Liverpool's players really want to go out the way to talk about it, and some of them, you know, might still have private views about some of the religions are still quite private. But Jurgen Klopp, if you ask him a question about religion, he'll never shirk it. He'll always sort of open up and talk about it, but he's not the sort of person to go and sort of ram it down somebody's throat. If you ask him, he'll be open, but he'll never sort of discuss it without him being asked. So that's the sort of approach I think Liverpool seem to have at the moment. And again, a bit like the team, the club is always a reflection of the manager in charge, particularly if he's having a really big impact on the club. And I think that seems to be the way it is. And, you know, you've got to remember players now, not just Liverpool, are being a lot more expressive about the religion, a lot more open about the religion, whether it's on social media or in the media after games. So I think other clubs will have to react to that and realise, you know, players want to speak about their faith, then that's fine. It'll be interesting to see which other clubs follow that lead, because it seems to be at the moment there's maybe only Liverpool a little bit who are quite comfortable with all that going on.
The thread that ties the footballers together in your piece, with the exception of Divock Origi, is their nationality. Obviously, Brazil has gone through an interesting evolution in terms of its religious adherence, and you talk about that a little bit in the piece. Could you flesh that out a little bit more for us?
Brazil, over the last sort of 20, 30 years, evangelicalism or Pentecostalism has risen dramatically from a point where there was only a very small percentage of the country who believed in Pentecostalism at the beginning of the 80s to a point now, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's certainly around the 20% mark, which is quite a big rise, really. Obviously, Brazil's a massive Catholic country. Pentecostalism has risen amongst particularly poorer communities, you know, people who may have felt left down by whether it's the left of politics or the right of politics. It's obviously swung from one way to the next, and not a great deal has changed for the poorest, most impoverished people in Brazil. Obviously, a lot of the footballers come from those types of backgrounds, and it's followed suit that obviously amongst footballers, particularly where people obviously view footballers in a largely negative way for lots of good reasons, but a lot of unfair reasons as well. I think a lot of footballers, from what I can tell in Brazil, have lent on religion in times of need, really. There's a lot of pressure on footballers now, so they find, particularly players who move abroad without any family. I think Lucas Moura, I've mentioned in the pieces, was one of those who had no religious faith until he moved to Paris, and then found a Brazilian community who were living in Paris and found some solace within that community through religion, and he's now since become a Pentecostalist. Alisson Becker's a slightly different story, because he comes from I don't want to classify him as a middle class Brazilian, because I think that would be unfair, but there is an emerging middle class in Brazil, and he was probably from a sort of the lower ends of that. You know, he's had sort of quite a lot of struggle in his life to get to the point where he wants to be, and has found solace in religion. People always say that there's 20% of Brazilians who are following Pentecostalism. I'd imagine around that figure, 20% of Brazilian footballers as well, of which there are a lot of footballers in Brazil. You know, I think particularly it's attractive for footballers who are in positions of pressure, who are in quite isolated, you know, the Brazilian diaspora is all across the world. Brazilian people tend to stick together, and if it's around religion, you know, that will then spread in the same way. So yeah, I think it's sort of become increasingly popular in Brazil as a consequence of what happened in 1994 when evangelical footballers at the 94 World Cup went onto the pitch holding hands for the first time.
Roberto Baggio, the saviour of Italy throughout this tournament. He's missed it, and Brazil win the World Cup.
Obviously, Brazil won that World Cup, and it was attached to success then as well. So that gave rise to a greater popularity.
Much of that evolution from Catholicism to Pentecostalism was driven by a frustration at the Catholic Church's inability to deal with various things: poverty, institutions, tendencies towards corruption, etc. Clearly this played into the appointment of Jair Bolsonaro as the president of Brazil in 2018.
There's a new boss in the land of the bossa nova, though this one moves to an altogether less gentle rhythm.
The economy went down. We lost, a lot of work, jobs, and now it's the time to change. This guy is an honest guy.
Jair Bolsonaro took a call of congratulations from Donald Trump and promised to make Brazil great again, with this Bible as his guide.
What was your sense of the tight relationship between religion and politics talking to these Brazilian footballers?
Unfortunately, the far right of Brazilian politics has attached itself to evangelical faith and as a consequence have been able to gain a lot of popularity. So this is where it becomes quite difficult, the conversation, because I think people just tend to associate Pentecostalism in Brazil with the far right, with Bolsonaro, whereas it's unfair to say that everybody who believes in evangelicalism in Brazil, that makes them a right-wing believer and will vote for Bolsonaro. Or it doesn't mean that not all of them will, but some of them will, because people like, I guess, to sort of narrow everything down to its most simplistic form. As far as I can tell, Alisson Becker's got more of a sort of a left-wing leniency, but is able to explain why people like Bolsonaro have been able to gain popularity. So it's quite a complex matter and a sensitive issue. I'm very conscious of that when I was writing it, that just because it's a trend, it doesn't necessarily explain everybody's individual belief and faith. So I had to sort of tread carefully when writing about it.
How did that change your attitude when writing about the role of religion in football, when there is that element that you've mentioned of evangelical Christianity being surreptitiously co-opted by the right in Brazil?
By its mere nature and existence, it does tend to divide people, even though somebody might have a very subtle religious view or a very private religious view. That was the challenge with writing about religion. I don't think you can ever be definitive, really, because you can only offer a flavour of what's going on. A lot of players, a lot of people, you might do the sign of the cross or do something as they go out onto the pitch. Doesn't mean that they necessarily want to talk about it and explain why. It just might be a small gesture which helps them through their lives or football careers. I spoke to a few agents about it, and some of the agents have got players who outwardly might show some religious faith, and it might seem like footballers are turning towards religion, but they say privately that they're not really that religious, and in some cases they're just doing it because it's a trend amongst players. Almost, it's like a cool thing to do. You know what I mean? Like one of my criticisms of religion, going back when I was a kid, it felt like people went to church just because they felt like they should, and this is what some of the agents and people behind the scenes are saying. They're just sort of doing it because it might make them seem more virtuous people, if you like, in the public eye. So there is an element of that as well that goes on. Now, you can't say that's the case about every footballer, but accordingly, if that's the way it is in society, I'm sure that's the way footballers are as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned that dynamic between fame and fandom. How do you see that dynamic operating here? Is religion becoming cool again?
It's such a strange phenomenon, football, isn't it, in the sense that it's never been more popular, but I equally think it's never been more hated as well. Like people seem to be in a permanent bad mood when it comes to football, whether it's their own teams or rival teams. So I do wonder whether, certainly older people, how they will receive that. I would suspect that like sort of younger people watching, younger players like Raheem Sterling, is probably be interesting to speak to him about his faith and how that guides him, because he's quite clearly got quite a strong religious faith. I wonder to what extent younger teenagers watching that will form an impression of the way to be, particularly if you're a younger footballer and you're seeing players or being around players. If you're a young player going into a football dressing room, you're likely to follow what the senior players do. So I suspect if it rises within football, it's only going to continue that at the youth levels. In terms of fandom, I just think Britain is, particularly relating to Britain, but Britain seems to be quite an agnostic country now, and I wonder whether people will flock back to believing in faith just because a player has faith. I think fans tend to accept players' faiths when they're doing well. So, for example, if Loris Karius was showing his faith, I don't think people would be as accepting of it because, obviously he's not as good a goalkeeper, whereas Alisson Becker's fantastic goalkeeper and probably the best in the world, and people are probably a bit more prepared to listen to it and accept it as a way of being. People tend to make their judgments around football based on the success of the player, not actually the depth of the character most of the time.
What's the response been to this piece? We all know that religion is notoriously divisive. Do you think this is one reason why religion isn't discussed more in sport?
I was quite surprised by the reaction to it, actually, because I sort of thought, well, we should get the piece out because it's been sitting there for a while. I didn't expect that so many people would have a view on it, and certainly looking at the comments section under the article on The Athletic, it certainly proved to me that there's a massive interest. It certainly plays a massive role in people's lives, and there's a massive interest in why it plays a role in footballers' lives. I sort of thought, well, there might be a bit of interest, but it's actually had a lot of people reading the article and generated quite a lot of subscriptions as well. So You know, I've been quite taken aback by the level of interest in the article, and it proves that there's definitely a desire to read more about it. So in future, you know, I think I will, you know, like to write a bit more about it and spend a bit more time, as much time as I can, trying to understand to what extent it explains the way things are in football.
I think one of the most curious aspects of modern sports journalism is the omerta that exists around religion. As your piece makes clear, a significant number of elite footballers are religious in some form, but that representation is probably not as well reflected in sports writers. Given, as we've seen, religion can be a fundamental impetus in people's lives, should we have spent more time talking about religion and its impact in modern football in sports journalism?
I think we should, yeah, because just because players don't want to talk about it and people in the past may not want to talk about it, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. The one thing that I've found is, obviously it took a fair bit of time to sort of pull that piece together, really. And it's not necessarily, you know, newsworthy. Okay, Alisson Becker baptising Roberto Firmino. I think a lot of people sort of treated it as a bit of a novelty, really. You know, and you'll see it go out on Twitter and people will look at the video and that'll be the end of it. That not many people tend to ask why or try and find out. You know, it's not a particularly newsworthy phenomenon. I think that's the challenge. I think as sports journalism changes, I think that's, without sounding like I'm trying to like give the hard sell around the Athletic, I think that's where we can sort of help a little bit and try and add a bit more layers onto an explanation of why things are changing within football. You know, obviously we do try and write about sort of the leading themes around football and why certain things are happening, and I think obviously the article I wrote has generated a fair level of interest, and it'll probably lead to me writing another article of, you know, trying to find out a bit more broadly rather than just in Liverpool about why things are changing. So I do think it's just about the time that people have really to write about these issues that are guiding footballers and changing the way football is existing as a sport. Hopefully, you know, that increasingly we'll be able to give a better representation of actually what's happening.
Simon Hughes covers Liverpool FC and football across Merseyside for The Athletic. Before you go, here at Football Today we're doing a giveaway with the guys at Classic Football Shirts. We've got a beautiful 2019-2020 Parma away shirt that could be yours. It's royal blue with yellow stripes and would make the perfect addition to your collection. All you have to do is follow our Twitter account, share our pinned post about the giveaway, and tag a friend in the comments. All the information can be found in the description of this episode, and you can enter any time this week until Friday at midnight. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today.